Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Fiona Leggat and Dr. Sean Figgins to the show. Fiona and Sean, great to have you on.
Thank you so much for inviting us. Yeah, we're really excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks Dan. Excited to have this chat.
I am super excited because we're going to be talking about a topic that I am really, really interested in, not least because, the specific topic we're going to be talking about has been a constant challenge that I found over the course of my sports psychology consultancy career. So super cool to be talking with you both. As always on the Sports Psych Show, let's get started with you introducing yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience. Fiona, why don't we go with you first?
Yeah, thank you. So I started off my academic kind of studies with an undergraduate and a master's degree in sports psychology, sport and exercise psychology. And that is ultimately what led to this paper and the topic that we're going to be discussing today around problematic players. I have a background in sport. I've played sport from a young age. Currently, I am a postdoc research associate at Kingston and St George's University. And my path has kind of moved into the health psychology domain now, but I still very much have an interest in sports psychology and working with Sean at the moment on a follow-up to the paper. So still very much interested in the topic area at hand.
Brilliant. Sean, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I am currently a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology and also research methods, but the less said about research methods, the better for most people, so we'll leave it at that. It is very important, though, I may add, as a caveat.
I think it's vital, isn't it? But I agree with you. Most of it was 30,000 feet and still climbing for me. Hence why I'm a consultant rather than a researcher now. Anyway, sorry, mate.
That's right. But I'd sort of consider myself as a really a social psychologist who's interested in group dynamics, leadership, and obviously this area of talented problematic players. So anything around that I'm really interested in, and that's kind of where my research lies, particularly within a sport domain, but also more recently some stuff in the exercise and physical activity space as well.
And do you have a sporting background? It's cricket, isn't it?
Well, yeah, allegedly. Cricket and football are two main sports. Okay. Was all right at them when I was younger, slowly on the decline, as with most people, but I still enjoy playing both of them and will try and do it until my body gives out.
Did you get to, Fiona, we'll come on to you in a second, but did you, Sean, get to any particular level for your cricket or not so much?
I was involved in kind of district and a little bit of county stuff.
Okay.
When I was younger.
It's a good level, mate.
I started quite late. I started when I was like 12.
Okay.
11 or 12 playing cricket. And I play at what's called Southern Premier League level. So it's an okay standard, but in the area I play, it's actually different to other areas. So there are multiple divisions, but still a fairly high kind of amateur standard somehow.
And how's your mental game?
Yeah, probably not very good. It's better than some people. I'm just slowly accepting that, the poor performances are the norm. So it's good with the acceptance, get less frustrated.
Oh, I love your low expectations. That's very useful to dial down the volume of stress. I like it. And Fiona, you kind of alluded to, certainly loving sport. What sports did you play? Were you a bit of an all-rounder, or were there specific sports you competed in?
So yeah, as a young person, kind of did a bit of everything, but mainly played badminton and football, and still play both at the moment. Okay. Probably a lot better at badminton than football, but not distinctly excellent at all. So kind of strong league player when I played badminton, and then football I play for a newly kind of up and coming team. I've had some recent successes, but very much kind of progressing.
And so what attracted you to the world of sports psychology then?
So when I played football as a youngster, really, I was involved in a team when I was at school through to kind of sixth form level. We were quite a successful team. We had some very, very good players. And yeah, some of my experiences, I think, and then some of my friends' experiences and things, and wanting to kind of better my own performance whilst learn about it more, I'd say sort of sparked that interest.
Good stuff. And well, for both of you, it sounds like you're involved in some really, really interesting research. And you've mentioned it yourselves. We're going to be talking about problematic players today. And we're going to specifically be digging into a paper that you've done alongside Matthew Smith. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah.
And that paper is entitled Talented but Disruptive, an exploration of problematic players. I almost wonder, before we dive into this, you're using the term problematic player. What made you come up with that term in the first place? I asked the question, I suppose, because I know I've put a few posts out on Twitter from time to time, entitled sort of dealing with problem players and making sure I put the word problem in inverted commas, because I know, I think there are some sports psychs out there who might sort of say there's no problem players, it's just, we have to be better coaches essentially, or something like that. So what led you to that term? Question for either of you.
So within the literature, like when I was writing my masters, there were lots of different words kind of being used to talk about these kind of players. And one that was popping up in the literature was like team cancer, and that didn't sit well with me. And we discussed it for a while because obviously other people had used it, but personally it didn't sit well with us. And therefore we went to problematic or problem player as kind of the next best thing, as it were, I guess. But like the interpretation of that, it's very interesting because, like you said, we need to be careful of that label.
Yeah.
Just because we might call it that or other people might call it that, it doesn't mean to say they are a problem. It is just our interpretation that they may be a problem. They may not actually be a problem. And they themselves might not perceive themselves to be a problem. So, yeah, we arrived at that term basically because we didn't like the term team cancer. But I think your hesitations around the kind of language is a really important consideration and something that we did pick up on in the paper.
What was the genesis of this research project for you both? How did your relationship start, your research relationship start, and what got you both into researching problematic players?
So for this project, is my relationship started after I think the idea had been formed. So that's kind of where I came into this, but it's really Fiona's paper. So I feel like Fiona should take the lead on that one without passing the buck.
Thanks. It came about from conversations with Matt, who's not with us today, about kind of the influence of these players in sport. So at the time, we were aware that I watch a lot of sport. He does. Sean does. A lot of people do. You see kind of people on the TV, and you hear about athletes in these through the media and different outlets that kind of resemble these issues that get talked about. They get talked about for doing A, B, and C. And we're aware of this literature that says, there might be these team cancer players out there, and they're these highly talented but disruptive people. So they encompass kind of these two informal roles, as it were. But actually, nobody had thought about what if someone encompassed both of those roles? Well, what would that look like? And that's kind of where the problematic player concept was born from. And so in that sense, we just wanted to explore more about what this player type of this informal role might look like, and how they manifest in teams, from the perceptions of coaches and their peers, so other athletes, and really just to learn a bit more and enhance our knowledge on what these people do and what they look like and that kind of thing.
It's so important, isn't it? As you've mentioned there, Fiona, this is in the popular press all the time, isn't it? Talented but disruptive. A certain football team or basketball team, and so on and so forth, have a really talented player, a player with great ability, but they can tend to be disruptive. And so subsequently one must ask, is it worth having this player on board? Sean, this must have been an exciting project to get involved with. Where did your interest in problematic players, talented but disruptive players, actually emerge from?
Yeah, so I think Fiona mentioned it and talked about it quite succinctly there, but they're so front and centre in the sporting sphere.
Yeah.
So, they're talked about constantly in the media. So we'll often see media articles more about perhaps people who are causing problems. And I think that's kind of that distinction we've got to make in terms of the labelling that you mentioned, rather than talking about necessarily people who are doing good things. I mean, we do see some of that. So the press have covered, for instance, the really good stuff that Marcus Rashford's done recently.
Mm-hmm.
But there are so many examples of it, and there are so many books in the media, autobiographies that people have written, where they talk about teammates or they talk about their own perspective of why they were considered to be a problem and how actually they weren't a problem. So I just think they're really interesting characters, and I think that point that Fiona made was really important about, well, the distinction we were making is, yes, they're problematic, but also they're vital to performance. So they produce match-winning performances, and we know that, especially at the elite level, but at all levels, performance is kind of paramount, isn't it? It's the king and the queen of everything, and what do you do with these people? Because I guess the key point is, and people have mentioned this, is when you've got your problematic player, but they don't necessarily perform or produce match-winning performances on a regular basis, people will just say, well, we can get rid of them. Whereas with these players, because they're so vital to performance, and I know a lot, you've worked a lot in the elite field, so you will have worked with coaches at various teams and in various sports. Their jobs are quite precarious if they're not getting results. So they need them, but they actually cause them a lot of issues as well. So that's my long-winded answer to why I became interested in this area.
No, it's not at all. I think it's such an important area because, as you say, I mean, my own personal experience has been I've had a lot of conversations with coaches at the elite level and also at the developing elite level, but I think this is still relevant for grassroots sports. Of course it is, around the personalities and the behaviours of players that might be construed as extreme or misadventurous or unhelpful even. And so I think this is such a relevant piece for coaches to start to understand. I mean, you begin by laying out what a team cancer is essentially, and what that might comprise of. So what negative behaviours can cause within a team. I mean, do you want to take us through a little bit of that, either of you, in terms of what negativity, what negative impact a disruptive player can have on a team? What does that look like?
Yeah, so there's a variety. I'll start, and then I'm sure Sean will carry on. But yeah, in terms of when I was doing the interviews with coaches and with other players, there were some really quite passionate interviews. Some very fruitful language. A lot of, you could feel people's frustration and stress coming out, let's say, during these conversations that we were having. About the negative consequences mainly. So with regards to the paper we came up with these kind of 3 themes with regards to consequences. The first being around this kind of team mentality impact. The other players in the team would experience perhaps drops in confidence as a result of the problematic players' actions in the team environment. So they perhaps would pick on their mistakes, perhaps, if they were feeling frustrated with them. And as a knock-on, they might feel uncomfortable and not enjoy the training environment. They might not enjoy being there, being around the problematic player, and even kind of lose love of their sport if they were in that kind of environment. And then in terms of another one would be really dividing the team. So these problematic players, they can, because they are so talented and because they are what perhaps other people in the team might aspire to be technically, their skill level might be would be really superior to that of their teammates. And obviously, therefore, their teammates would aspire to have that same kind of performance level. And perhaps because of that, other people in the team, it can create this divide because other people in the team would like to be like them in the performance way, and other people would not like to be with them because they don't like to be around them. They don't like their kind of their personality traits, their characteristics, this like over appreciation of themselves, and they don't want to aspire to be like that. So in that, kind of cliques are formed, and there's a shift in the team whereby perhaps in some extreme cases, people wouldn't want to speak to or even play with people who were not in their clique, which would potentially cause a lot of problems for a coach who's trying to create a more cohesive team. And therefore, that would massively impact performance ultimately if you cannot get a team to kind of gel and be there for one another. Sean, if you want to continue.
Yeah, so there are some interesting other ones. So, and this comes, I guess, this is where that cancer terminology came in. It's that the impact of their behaviour or their behaviour can actually spread. So what it can do is you can see some kind of contagious effect of people becoming more frustrated within the team. So there can be a little bit more conflict between players, not just necessarily the talented problematic player, but other players as well. There can be a reduction in effort because people just become so frustrated with dealing with this player. They actually withdraw. And also, one of the key ones, and I guess for coaches who might be listening as well, is it can lead to increased scrutiny of the coach because these talented, problematic players sometimes, and whether this has kind of negative intentions or not, they might have good intentions. They can sometimes question the coach quite often. So the coach can find themselves having to explain themselves a lot more, which isn't necessarily a bad thing if you've got the right kind of culture there. But it can be threatening, I guess, in some way to the coach's level of power.
Yeah.
And in a more recent study that we've got ongoing as well, a really interesting finding is that it's a real draining experience for coaches and staff, in that they seem to drain a lot of their energy and a lot of their time because they're having to deal with and work with this player in particular, which takes time away from others, which then has a knock-on effect on the other players, thinking, well, we're not getting the time and effort we need. All the effort is going into working with this really talented player who causes a lot of problems. So in other words, it leads to a cascading effect.
Gotcha. So that's a great overview of some of the things that you found. Let's back up a second here and let's pinpoint details around the research that you did. Tell me how many participants there were. Who were those participants? Was it a structured interview? Give me the lowdown on the method of your research.
Okay, so in terms of participants, there are 15 participants. We started with coaches, were coaches of different. So they coached teams of different performance levels. So we had a couple who were more elite coaches, and then a couple who were more kind of recreational coaches. Different sports. So we had netball, football, cricket. I think we had a variety.
Yeah.
And then it became clear that actually, coaches' perceptions are all well and good, but they were saying things like, in terms of the impact on the team, they weren't sure. They could see things from their point of view, but they almost said, you need to ask players. So I went back out and kind of recruited some senior players in their respective teams. So people who perhaps possessed captaincy roles or had been in their team for a long time. People who, would class themselves as a senior within the team, who perhaps might be looked upon for guidance or who knew the team well. And again, they described, they gave their overview and their interpretation of what a talented, problematic player looked like, what they kind of did. And we had indications come out that, again, they felt somewhat less impacted than junior players, than people coming new into the team, because they already perhaps had a relationship with the problematic player. They had that level of authority almost in the team that meant that they were kind of protected or just not a target of the problematic player's actions, perhaps. So they went back out and interviewed some junior players who were new players in the team, who hadn't been with the team for that long, to kind of get their perspectives. And again, they differed slightly because they had, in some cases, some more kind of severe impact from the problematic player. Like they described feeling more targeted for kind of blame culture and things like that. So it was very iterative, the sampling in that sense. And again, it was somewhat purposive because we wanted to identify different sports, different levels, different genders. We wanted to try and get as much of a mix as we could.
Wow, interesting. So 15 participants, a mix of coach, senior players and junior players across different sports and different levels. So quite a comprehensive mix. And I believe that you divided findings into 4 overarching themes. Theme 1 being the characteristics and behaviours of the problematic player. Theme 2, the perceived causes of the problematic player's behaviour. Theme 3, the perceived consequences from the problematic players on the team. And theme 4, the potential considerations for individuals operating alongside problematic players. So basically how we deal with problem players, right? So I think there's some really, really interesting discursive points within these themes. Theme 1, the characteristics and behaviours of the problematic players. And you've alluded to some of these already, but let's really dig down on some of these. Again, a question to either of you. Could you tell us a little bit about the characteristics and behaviours of the problematic player? Can you dig a little bit deeper on a granular level for us here?
So one of the key ones is that they have this very high perception of their own ability. So this real kind of belief that they are a very good player, and a superior player to other people. Whether that's the truth or not is another matter. But in some ways, we can see what that might cause some of the issues that we talk about, and we'll probably tap into later. And what this can mean is they want appreciation as well. So they want praise. They want to be seen as kind of special, and I think in some ways unique. So they want this kind of hierarchy where they are the best player, and there's a group of players below them, perhaps, who aren't quite to their standard. And sometimes this can be unrealistic as well. So they can set themselves really unrealistic goals, which when they're not met can actually cause them issues because they see that as quite threatening to their, I hasten to say their ego, but perhaps their confidence and their sense of self-worth. So when they don't do things, when they don't do well, that's why they might act out in other ways, such as, criticising other players or belittling other players to try and take the attention away from themselves. So engaging in some of that more kind of critical banter with others. And I think the key thing as well in relation to this, and this all links in, and you might see some perhaps of those kind of personality characteristics or the darker personality characteristics coming into play here, is they have a real focus on themselves as well, often at the expense of others. And when I say others, I mean teammates, but I also mean support staff. So because they're so focused on themselves and because they have such a high opinion of themselves, what it means is that they often don't want to focus on things that they're not so good at. Or in this case, not always, but in the case of the people that we interviewed, that was kind of a key kind of assumption, is that they don't want to admit where they're wrong, or perhaps where they're not doing so well, or the areas they could work on. So they're not willing to take on advice from other people. So if a coach came up to them and said, look, you're good in this area, but one of the areas we really need to work on is this, they might not take that very well and just dismiss kind of your instructions and your feedback. And also because of that high opinion of themselves, sometimes it can lead them to have a lack of effort, certainly in things that they perceive not very important, because they think, well, I don't actually need to. I'm a very good player anyway. I don't need to do this. I possess this talent. I'm going to perform on a match day. So why bother? I do have to add, though, in relation to this, that isn't always the case with some of these players. So I think there are some really high-profile examples where people might necessarily fit into this. And again, we'll probably talk about the labels later, fit into this label, but they're also really hardworking. So it's an important point to make that. But that's one of the key ones. And then I don't know whether, Fiona, you want to talk about the kind of second bit about the minimising their own weaknesses.
Yeah, so I mean, you've touched on it a little bit. So in terms of like the other core kind of characteristic, I guess, is around this minimising their own error and protecting, in a bid to protect, not perhaps their ego, but their confidence and their outward appearance to others in the team. So as Sean kind of alluded to, they perhaps don't want to take advice necessarily, not all the time, but sometimes they might not want to work on their weaknesses, especially perhaps in front of other people, because that then would threaten this kind of athletic identity and this high performance label and this superior ability that they feel they have. And within the team environment, obviously, many sports are team games. If there are mistakes being made that perhaps are the problematic player's fault, but they feel perhaps not their fault, they can engage in this kind of blame culture, whereby perhaps they may blame other members of the team for something that they've done, but that could have been influenced by another member of the team. So, for example, in football, maybe they didn't put in a very accurate pass. They perhaps might blame it on the pass that they received from somebody else. Where blame could be put, blame may be put, if that makes sense. And then in line with that, there might be these emotional outbursts. So problematic players may, for example, from the people that we interviewed, they said that they may kind of shout at other people if they weren't doing something right, or if they were perhaps threatening the team's performance, they would, make them feel belittled and incompetent. And again, it's that kind of, they want to protect not only them, they want to protect themselves, but they are a part of that team. So it's that balance that they may kind of they may be trying to achieve, whereby they want to protect themselves and make themselves look as good as they can within that team.
I love it. Because I'm thinking of the coaches listening in, and as the coaches listen in, they're going to be reflecting on their experiences. And I think what we're all hearing you both say is from your interviews with these 15 players at different levels, different sports, are breaking down characteristics. What you heard as interviewers are characteristics and behaviour split into two themes: over-appreciation, I should say, and minimising error. These are the kind of characteristics and behaviours they're engaging in. There's actually 5 things I wrote down here, 5 things I heard. Probably the overarching thing I heard, and you didn't say this, but I wrote this down, that classic fixed mindset. I'm not going to get all unidimensional about this, as mindset stuff tends to be, but that classic fixed mindset, and interestingly, you mentioned athletic identity, because, fixed mindset could be construed as striving to maintain that sense of athletic identity. I'm this great player, and everything I do and every perception of me has to stay constant around this athletic identity of me being a great player. I hear avoidance, so avoiding being coached potentially. I hear blame, instigating a blame culture potentially. And I also hear interpersonal abuse. So all of the above seem pertinent. So a couple of questions here. Did I miss anything out there in my summary? Did that seem fairly accurate, as in, was I actually listening and being a good sports psychologist? And the third thing is, interestingly, both of you pulled away from this notion of protecting ego. Why? Question for either of you.
I guess because it comes down to that interpretation and label kind of conversation that we had at the beginning again. We don't want to suggest that they have this ego, this really strong ego, that they strive to protect above everything else, because we don't know that. Like, we haven't interviewed problematic players themselves. That was not part of the research and what we did. So all of this is interpretation from what other people have told us, and our own, obviously, interpretation on top of that. So yes, in some ways, it is kind of, a lot of this is around their attempts to protect this kind of perhaps easily crushed ego, but it's our interpretation of that, I guess. I don't know, Sean, if you want to add any more.
I think it's just purely for me about the use of labels. I mean, we did actually use ego in the paper, but I think since the paper we've kind of, because that was 2 or 3 years ago now, I think we're very aware of the labels we use, and we talk about that more broadly, about the kind of labels that are used to put these people into a kind of box and how that might impact on our perception of them. But I think if you dig down deep into it, it's not necessarily their ego as such. It's more their sense of self-worth and their sense of self-esteem. And then, at a micro level, their kind of self-efficacy in specific situations and self-belief, rather than ego, because I think it's just got negative connotations associated with it. People will say someone's got a big ego, and what that means is people think they're arrogant, I think.
Yeah. Out of interest, when you interviewed these coaches and players, was there ever a sense, verbally or otherwise, from these coaches and players, that they understood that this talented player, this talented but disruptive player, might need to have that over efficacious stance, might need to exhibit a sense of brashness or confidence in order to play at the level they're playing at? In other words, I get why they were disrupted, because what they needed, that sense of confidence. Was there any sense of that at all from who you interviewed?
In terms of players, not so much. So players that we spoke to tended to be more kind of they tended to not necessarily see that point of view as much. They tended to just see them as really frustrating to try and work with, within the team environment. From a coaching perspective, actually, it's really interesting you say that, because I think some of the coaches that we spoke to acknowledge that actually this attitude and this kind of ability had got them obviously to the place that they got to, and in some cases these were quite elite levels, and therefore because of that they kind of had this acknowledgement that yes, this was just who they were, and perhaps this might just be how they are, whether they can be not necessarily changed, but is there any way to improve this or not, because this is now who they are. But in terms of whether that facilitated their performance, I don't know that we got enough to make that kind of suggestion.
Moving on to the next theme, perceived causes of problematic players' behaviours. We've kind of delved into this a little bit already, and actually that word ego comes up. But there are sort of two sub-themes here around perceived causes of the players' behaviours. Shifts in power and poor performance. Again, appreciating we've touched on this, we've spoken a little bit about it, but is there anything perhaps Sean and Fiona to add here at all?
So in terms of so the main kind of causes that we highlighted within the paper were these kind of changes in power and responsibility within the team. So perhaps that would be a new coach, that might be a new captain, that might be someone coming in and altering the way the things had been done, so altering the status quo, and therefore that having a knock on the problematic player and perhaps their role within that team. And then the second one being kind of poor performance from the team initiating this behaviour. So perhaps when the player came in, for example, or started at the club, the team might have been winning and been very successful, and in some cases that did happen, and they weren't the problem at all. In fact, in several of the interviews, people described how once the team had, got a winning streak, or they'd won a game and they'd got that under their belt, the problematic players' impact in some cases, again, not always, in some cases, did kind of lessen. And therefore that was a really kind of interesting idea that winning can really heighten or diminish the impact of this player in practice. But I know from our new research that Sean might be able to shed more light on, that there might be some other kind of more current insights on perceived causes.
Well, why don't you, Sean, again, appreciating that this paper hasn't been published yet, could you give us any more information on causes?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of others that relate to the individual themselves, to tackle those first, because a lot of what we found were things related to the individual. So one of them that people, well, this paper, just to provide some context, is sports psychologists' perspective on working with these players. And one of the key things that they discussed was them having a lack of kind of awareness of their impact, or a lack of empathy for people. So in some cases, they're just not aware of the impact that their behaviour is having. And in other cases, they just don't appear to have empathy with the rest of their team, or the coaches and support staff. There's some other interesting ones where people talk about parental influence. So that seems to be a perennial one whenever you speak to anyone about why people have developed in the way they have. I guess it comes back to classic psychology. Parents having an impact, perhaps having overbearing parents, or parents who have a really high opinion of the athlete, and that can kind of be socialised into those players in their development. And interestingly, one of the key ones that the psychologist talked about was actually the macro kind of culture itself, and how the development pathway has almost always placed them on a pedestal. And there's a bit of an incongruence between the development pathway and then the elite game. In the development pathway, it's all about developing individual players, Whereas when they come to the elite game, it's all about, well, you have to be part of this team. So whilst they're playing as part of teams during their development, really being a good teammate might not be that important if they're just a brilliant player, because they're more likely to make it at the elite level. So actually, it might not just be as plain sailing as being their fault as the kind of this our initial paper makes out. So yeah, it might be more of a cultural thing as well as interacting with some of those personal characteristics, or might even amplify some of those personal characteristics.
It's quite a topical thing, isn't it? Because at the moment, obviously, there's some very elite teams that have got some very elite players, and actually, everyone asks why aren't these players all playing well? And in some cases, there may be perhaps more than one of these players in one environment, and if that happens, it would then be interesting to explore what happens then, because you've got more than one person vying to be perhaps top dog in their eyes. It could lead to perhaps, further detrimental consequences to the team.
It's so interesting because there's so much that's popping into my head there. And just at the end, Fiona, I think of Damien Hughes came on many moons ago and talked about the star model that he sort of pinpointed Real Madrid as having for a number of years versus a kind of a developmental model. Developmental model is not the right term and not the term he used, but that kind of model that was probably utilized by Barcelona for a period of time, and how they had a greater sustained success over Real Madrid. Of course, it's all going in a different direction now, but coming back to some of the stuff you talked about there, Sean, from your new paper where you've interviewed sports psychologists on this topic, and thinking with the work of Dr. Jamie Taylor, had Jamie on a few weeks ago and talking about coherence across a talent development pathway and how important that is, and actually injecting some negative emotion into that pathway. And it could take this form. It can't always just be positive, and it can't always be, inflating that ego, if we're going to use that term. We've got to help players to be more realistic about where they are when they reach the first team. And then finally, for me, the last thing to say, and there's not going to be a question here, guys, but if you want to come back at me for anything here, please do. Just what you initially said, again from your new paper, Sean, around these players were kind of oblivious to it. They weren't aware. It was part of who they are. And I just immediately, being a personality science junkie, I just think of agreeableness and low agreeableness, and how, essentially our personalities are our filter systems in many respects. They lead to inattentional blindness. We don't see this stuff in ourselves necessarily, or it just takes a great deal of self-awareness. So it all completely resonates with me. Again, no question, guys, but I don't know if some of the things I said there sparked anything for you.
Yeah, definitely. I think in terms of the personality stuff, anyone who's really interested in that area, you'll probably see a lot of, and I'm not saying this is the case, but you'll probably see a lot of similarities with highly narcissistic individuals.
Right.
On this as well. So interestingly, there was a paper recently by Bolter and colleagues from Bangor, and they looked at narcissists and team cohesion. It really piqued my interest. But what they actually found was that people who are narcissistic tend to have less problems in teams with other narcissists. And one of my thoughts related to that was, and it kind of flies in that face of that stuff we were talking about there in terms of that top dog stuff, is that perhaps some of the issues are that because these people are so highly talented, they have issues in these teams because, as we've mentioned, one of the issues is poor performances from the whole team. If you've got a team where everyone's performing well, you're less likely to see these issues because it's less likely to be a threat to that individual's sense of self-worth, their identity, because they've got other people at their level. So that literature, although some of that is from the organisational literature, I think it doesn't seem to fit with that kind of narrative of, well, they want to be top dog. it more fits with the narrative of, if I'm part of a team that's performing really well, it's going to also make me look good. Then are we going to see those issues? I mean, we don't know the answer to that, obviously, but yeah, there's some of that narcissism stuff there. And in relation to that talent development environment, I do think we are seeing a shift in a lot of them. I know we see a lot of them come out now. So what I don't want is people thinking the psychologists and everyone else is completely slamming the talent development environments. I think people are going to try and develop more kind of teamwork behaviours and more well-rounded individuals, as well as highly talented performers, because obviously that's the bread and butter. I just wanted to throw that caveat in there before people try and lynch me or something.
Yeah, and perhaps when I spoke about Jamie's work on cohesion, I talked about throwing negative emotion into the talent pathway. I probably should have also said that we're also talking about positive behaviours and characteristics as well, and the importance, as you mentioned there, of holistic development, in interpersonal and intrapersonal development as well. So really, really important stuff. And of course, narcissism is at the low end of agreeableness, isn't it? That dark triad of Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. Theme 3, consequences of the problematic player's presence. So, talking about the consequences here, and that comprised itself of 3 sub-themes. So the consequences of problematic players. And again, we're kind of going back over some of the things we've spoken about, but I really want to layer this and get this structured. So the consequences of problematic players' behaviours and characteristics. It influences team mentality. It can cause a team divide. And it can create a negative behaviour spread. Would either of you like to take this up on a more granular basis?
Yeah, I'll kick off. So I'll start with the first one that we talked about in the paper. So team mentality, and as we've kind of alluded to, some of the characteristics and the behaviours of these types of players. Again, not every problematic player has every type of characteristic and things that we've talked about, but their focus on themselves and this kind of blame culture and their inability, their emotional outbursts rather. Those kinds of behaviours can really influence negatively other members of the team, specifically members of the team who perhaps are new to the team, who don't know that player, they don't have that relationship, they don't understand, oh, that's just what he's like. They don't have that kind of contextual information. So for them, it can affect their confidence in a detrimental way, especially if they're being blamed for things that they perhaps feel aren't necessarily their fault, or they're perhaps trying to learn. And in terms of that kind of learning culture, where training is thought of as a place where you try new things, you perfect your skills, as it were. And when you've got perhaps a problematic player who's really talented and can do these skills, but is perhaps, blaming you for things or shouting at you, for example, for trying new things and for trying to get better yourself, that could be really hurtful, actually. So that's, quite an important consequence to talk about. And then as a result of that, it can lead to feelings of things like discomfort, not enjoying training, not enjoying playing, and mentally, perhaps not being able to concentrate, not being able to focus, always being aware that player, could come out with something in that environment. Not saying that they're always going to, because they might not, but there is that potential. So a lot of, with players that we interviewed, there was a lot of kind of feeling on edge, as if there was something rumbling that could blow at any kind of point. And actually, several of them described being more comfortable and training being a more pleasant environment when those players are not necessarily there. Again, they acknowledge that the quality of the training might not be as good because that player's not there. They haven't got their knowledge, their ability to help them perform drills or do things as they wanted to. But the atmosphere was perhaps more inviting. So again, the problematic player is not all bad in that sense because their talent is really helpful to the team. A lot of players could kind of see that, they acknowledged the importance of their skills in that sense. But it was this kind of cost that comes attached to that really did influence their mentality in both training and in competition.
It's so nuanced, isn't it, Sean, in terms of... I just find it really fascinating, just listening to Fiona there, how talented but problematic players can improve training from by their presence, the quality of their play, the demands. Maybe, I mean, I suppose it depends on the content, doesn't it, of the problems that they might produce. Are they being so demanding and having a moan at players for not being demanding enough? And actually, that can help, that can aid in learning. But if they're just creating a blame culture, if they're just having a go at everybody, that can diminish learning. It can cause distraction. It can reduce enjoyment. There's just that fine line, isn't there? And I suppose it almost feels like it can depend. It depends. It can depend on the content. No question. Do you have any thoughts on the consequences of disruptive players?
I guess in relation to the point you're making there about their kind of what they're saying to people and the demands they're putting on people, it can really depend upon the relationships between the players, I think.
Yeah, good point.
So from our research that we've done, it appears like they don't have that many relationships with people. They tend to have some relationships. So as we mentioned here, that like one of the impacts is they create or cause divide and create cliques. So they tend to have like a smaller group that they are comfortable with, and whether that's they're actually comfortable with them or whether they have them there for kind of support if there are any issues is kind of another question. But if you're not in that clique, then you might feel really uncomfortable. And if they are placing demands on you, albeit, like we say, in a performance environment, it might seem like those demands and those criticisms might be considered, well, actually, we need this. You as an individual, you don't perform well in these areas. They're providing you with honest feedback. But if you haven't got a very good relationship with that individual and they're constantly providing a lot of criticism your way, regardless of whether that's to protect their own kind of self-esteem because they're trying to direct attention away from themselves, or with the right intentions of, well, actually, I want the team to improve, I want you to improve, that might have a negative impact on somebody because, that if you're constantly getting that, or you're fearful of ridicule from this really talented, problematic player, then it could have those negative consequences.
And if the relationship isn't there, then it relies on those targeted players to have good enough, let's say, reflexive self-talk to be able to explain to themselves, okay, I don't particularly like this player and I don't like the demands that this player is placing on me and it makes me feel uncomfortable, but I've just got to get on with it. And I've just got to keep learning and keep doing what I've got to do. And that kind of reflexive self-talk is a real skill, isn't it? So it's enormously challenging.
Yeah. And I think a lot of this is really interesting. So the more I research this, or the more research this, the more complicated I think it gets. I think we all have really kind of like neat and linear kind of solutions to problems and putting people in these boxes, but not all problematic players show these behaviours. Not all problematics have these same consequences. They might show one or two or have one or two of these consequences, but often it's kind of an interaction as well. So I know, for instance, you had Mustafa Sarkar on recently talking about psychological safety, and you could suggest that the reason that these players react in the way that they do, these problematic players, is that the environment to them isn't psychologically safe. And I know you've had also Matt Slater and Will Thomas and Jeremy Holt on talking about values and team identity. Now, if you've got a really strong team identity and let's say in a football team 10 of the 11 starting 11 really buy into that identity, but your talented problematic player doesn't buy into that identity, or has different opinions to them, then that might be an issue and cause issues in itself. So I think it's a really complex case. I don't think it's just as simple as saying, these players are the cause of all these problems. I think there are a lot of different things at play here. So it is really, really complicated.
Yeah, it's also really important to note, I think, as well. And I think we touched on it in the paper that although coaches and players can see these players as, really talented and perhaps really valuable in the team, there were cases whereby their behaviour got so bad in some cases whereby they actually sort of forgot that they were talented, and that kind of talent was just kind of disregarded. It was almost a case of this has crossed a line. And again, like Sean said, it is so nuanced and complex in that sense, whereby every case was so different. Like, not every person that we spoke to described the problematic player the same. They were all really had their unique little differences. Some were people blaming other people, some were not, some led to cliques, some didn't have cliques, but they had almost the rest of the team forming an alliance, like not against, but yeah, almost against the problematic player. So it is quite complicated.
The two C words, complex and complicated. It really is. And you mentioned there, Sean, the episode with Dr. Matt Slater on social identity theory. That's episode 52, and with Jeremy Holt and Dr. Will Roberts, episode 17, which is both of which are really worth listening to. And it just demonstrates almost the importance of coaches being great detectives of behaviour and detectives of, almost like an anthropological detective. I think is so important. You also mentioned the word, Sean, solution, and that leads us to our fourth theme: considerations for working with problematic players. And this was considered really at two levels: leadership and environmental. So, to either of you here, who wants to talk a little bit about these themes of leadership and environmental?
So I think it's interesting, the kind of, just to put this out there in terms of when we're interviewing people about how to deal with them, a lot of people don't seem to know how to deal with them. So a lot of it is like, well, actually, we don't know. And when I speak to psychologists, and obviously yourself as a psychologist, and I'm saying, well, how do you work with these players? They're like, I don't know. There's not a lot of evidence to kind of to draw from. So I'm having to do this kind of blind and on the hop. And actually, I'm not sure whether how effective it was. But some of the key ones that people have talked about, they really do relate to two or three key things. So you've got your leadership, and that can be as simple as, well, being quite firm with them. So setting these boundaries, setting these expectations, and then holding them to account when they don't meet those standards. But there's that caveat of going about that in a in a friendly way, so in a non-critical way. I mean, I don't know what that might necessarily look like. It sounds a bit of a contradiction of terms, but that might be one. And it might be related to that relationship element and the connection element that we talked about earlier. So trying to develop a relationship with them by perhaps trying to get to know them better. So that might serve two purposes. It will hopefully enhance the relationship between you and the problematic player, but also it might help you understand them a bit more. It might help you understand where they're coming from and perhaps perceive them in a different way. Another suggestion is, if you perhaps haven't, let's say as a coach, okay, you need this player in the team, but perhaps you haven't got a great relationship with them. What you could do is try and use people who have got a good relationship with them to try and I say in inverted commas, people can't see me, but tackle their problematic behaviour. So getting them to approach them about it, some perhaps who they've got a bit more of an affinity with, a bit more respect for, to try and work with them. So that's kind of from a leadership perspective. And just before I kind of pass over to Fiona, in relation to leadership and staff, one of the interesting things that a lot of the psychologists mentioned when I spoke to them is this idea of you need to work with and through support staff. Yes, but often they perceive that actually the reaction of staff to this players or these players' behaviours can actually cause more issues. It can amplify it. And it might be best to try and work on kind of like a culture of acceptance within staff members to try and negate and minimise some of the negativity that our reaction brings to them. So I guess it relates to that lens. And we talk about these things. We're calling people problematic players. If I gave you the behaviour of somebody in a team meeting openly criticises the team or provides some criticism of the team, and I said to you that came from somebody who's a well-respected senior player, that might change your perception of it. Whereas if that comes from a problematic player, because of that lens we're wearing of them as a problem, that might actually impact on the way you perceive it. So it's really important to try and, in some ways, kind of park our assumptions when we're dealing with these people and park or take off those lenses, so to speak.
Fiona, anything to add there?
Yeah. So it's like almost kind of not putting them in that box, as it were, kind of every time they say something, giving them that chance to be heard and listened to. So in terms of environmental things, so Sean's like given a really good overview of the leadership considerations, but in terms of the environment, a lot of the coaches and some of the players as well talked about, something that heightens difficulty in working with like problematic players can be to around this. What does the rest of the team look like? What is the talent like in the rest of the team in comparison? And is there a large disparity, or is there not? So, for example, with coaches, they suggested that it would be much easier to drop the problematic player, for example, if they had another player who could come in and do a similar, and perhaps not as good job, obviously, because the problematic player is extremely talented, but could do a job for the team whereby, perhaps they wouldn't be then suddenly a weakness in the team. And then the problem would come when that player didn't exist, for example, if the disparity between the problematic player and the replacement was so large, then they felt they had to, play the problematic player, which in some cases they felt then reinforced this kind of bad behaviour in places, because they're still being selected for the team, even if they're perhaps negatively creating this emotional impact on the rest of the team. So that was something that they talked about as a really kind of interesting consideration within the team environment. As Sean suggested, in terms of a leadership perspective, it's really important to develop perhaps relationships with these players. But from an environmental perspective, that can take time, and that can be a cost or a barrier to perhaps implementing, developing a relationship as that kind of strategy almost, because developing a relationship is important, but we know how long that take a really long time to understand a player, develop that rapport with them. And for some coaches and psychologists in these team environments, we know that there is this intense time pressure to get results and to get your team performing. And therefore, in some cases, questions could be asked like, do you have the time to do that? And in a lot of cases, coaches said they perhaps didn't, especially at less elite levels where you perhaps only see your players a few times a week or 3 or 4 times a week, and you've got to see all the players, you haven't necessarily got that time. So as much as you really want to invest that time, again, it could be a balancing act with working with these players. That's just, probably not very helpful to listeners. But another really important consideration to kind of think about. I think just lastly, it really depends on what you want from the team. What is the goal and the value of your team? Like Sean said, you want this shared common goal, but is that a short-term goal? Is that we can manage with this player for the next couple of months, versus a long-term goal? So what are you going to do kind of long-term? And I think those are two perhaps different questions within the team environment and within what the club or the team wants that might be important to consider with these players. It might not be a one size all fits kind of approach.
I just think it's fascinating what you both said there. I really do. Just at the end there, it just made me think. What's the context? Every coaching context is different. Sometimes coaches have as little as a few weeks to get this right. Otherwise, they can be out of the job. Obviously, at the elite level. And then sometimes coaches have longer, but then often those coaches who have longer, they're working in a context when perhaps they're only seeing players on a Tuesday and a Thursday and they don't get as long to create relationships. So there's difficulty across the board. I'm going to make a few comments, no questions, but it'd be great to have your thoughts back at me here, because my brain was just whirring there, thinking about previous guests on previous topics with relation to what you're talking about. I'm thinking about the model of if you do have time to establish relationships. Episode number 16 of the Sports Light Show, talking with Professor Sophia Jowett and her 3C plus 1C model of establishing relationships can be really, really useful here, potentially. And I do think there is a narrative within your findings here where a coach or a player had talked about the importance of establishing a relationship. I'm also thinking about, as you mentioned, Sean, there's a lot of people out there who are going, there's not a lot of research evidence out here as to how we cope with this. It's quite a blank slate. But it also makes me think of episode 68, talking with Professor Stephen Rolnick and the use of motivational interviewing, how coaches can upskill themselves to be able to listen and empathize. And I wonder if that's an entry point, not to every, because as we're saying, every case can be different, but some players who could be construed as difficult, is our entry point to actually sit down with them and listen to them and empathize with them. And I remember watching a recent documentary where one very, very famous manager spoke to a very talented, but I don't know if he was disrupted, but seen as lazy player, lazy in inverted commas. And for me, in my humble opinion, the coach just talked at that player rather than listened to that player. And I do sometimes wonder if we need to be better at doing that, all of us, as coaches. And then my final thing to say, I suppose, is drawing on the episode with Suze Burton-Wiley, episode 124 from British Sailing, talking about environment, talking about values and behaviours. And again, I come back to, is coaching about being an anthropologist? Is it about setting, as you mentioned, I think it was you, Fiona, mentioned setting down rules and behaviours and guidelines, but it's doing that, and then it's recognising that there are going to be people who don't have the same kind of values that lead to the same kind of behaviours, and so it's detecting what that looks like and actually being patient around that rather than simply diving and going, no, you need to behave in accordance to us and what we want. Actually, we need to be a bit more patient and to learn if we've got that time. That's my ramble, guys, so no questions, but if you've got any thoughts there, it would be more than welcome.
Yeah, that's just it. It's interesting, that last point you touched upon in terms of that element of, and the social identity theorists would talk about we-ness. So if you ever listen to not just the people in sport, but Alex Haslam and Stephen Reicher, they talk about this element of we-ness quite often. And there's actually really, if anyone's really interested in identity, it's a really nice book by Jay Van Bavel and Dominic Packer called The Power of Us. I'm not plugging it because I get no funds from it, but they talk about identity and they talk about some of these issues more broadly. But one of the key things about social identity and values is that, according to the research, having some kind of diversity of thought is really important. So it's not about creating a group where there isn't any diversity of thought, everyone gets along all the time, and there's no kind of deviation from the norms, and everyone just basically does and says the same thing. Nobody criticizes anybody. Actually, that can be useful within groups. And I think that touches on the point of psychological safety where, again, I'm not an expert in this area, but, it's becoming more prominent in sport. But that element of, well, people should feel free to talk up and be vulnerable. So be able to actually say, well, I don't quite agree with that, or I think we could do things better, or here's my perspective on how things are going and how we can do that better. So ultimately, the culture may actually be hindering our perception of these players in some ways. So if we've got a really rigid view of what our identity is and they don't necessarily fit into that box, then that's going to amplify our reactions to their behaviour and perhaps make us more frustrated and more stressed. So if we can create some space for diversity of thought and in some ways kind of some form of dissent, I suppose, within that, then that might enable us to have more healthy relationships in the team and a better culture when we've got these types of individuals, because we know, and you'll know better than certainly me, Dan, that these people are so imperative. People who can perform under pressure, score the goals, score the runs, under pressure and consistently are worth their weight in gold, and that's why they're paid the big bucks.
Completely. I always remember a coach who worked under Sir Alex Ferguson for a bit. I won't name names, but he took me to the players that Sir Alex Ferguson actually gave a bit of rope to because he had to. And I think that probably realistically goes on with a lot of teams at the very elite level. There are always going to be some players that that head coaches or managers have to give a bit more rope to. You close the paper out by giving the reader some applied recommendations, which I think are fantastic. So, Fiona, as lead researcher here, would you like to take us through? I'm sure we've mentioned these, but why don't you take us through some of these applied recommendations, or recommendations for coaches?
Yes, I'll take us through some of them, and then I'm sure Sean can elaborate where he wants to. But yeah, so the first recommendation we make in the paper is to kind of enhance the coach-athlete relationship. So we've talked a lot about that, and again, you've made reference to Sophia Jowett's work kind of on that. So principally, I think it just comes down to trying to understand the player, trying to listen to them and hear their point of view, not just sitting there letting them talk at you, kind of, really actively listening and trying to work with them, and developing that rapport and that relationship. And I think that will come the more obviously you listen to them. So that would be the first one. The second one is to provide individual consideration and gratification to the player. So we know at times these players may be thinking mainly about themselves and their own performance, and therefore perhaps if you manage to build that in to your work with the player, perhaps aside from the team, perhaps with the team, make them feel special, as Sean said earlier. And if you can manage to do that in a way where you make them special, but you also can make the rest of the team feel special in another way, then that might be a useful kind of recommendation.
Yeah, I think the other key ones we've talked about leadership, and one of the things you can do is involve the problematic player in your leadership group, particularly if you're coming up with values. I mean, you might get them to help set what those are if you've got a leadership group. It might enhance kind of their connection with the teammates and might make them more likely to buy into them. But again, there's a caveat to this in that these are suggestions, so it might not necessarily work. And then the last one is that element of the labels. So being very aware of kind of the language that we use and the frames we put around problem. And I think that links to the pig wrestling book by Pete Lindsay and Mark Borden. The frames kind of we put around the problem can often impact on the way we view it. So it's almost trying to park your assumptions and those labels when you're dealing with people, especially in terms of this individual problematic player, because that might impact on the way you view everything they do, and everything they do isn't always a problem. So being aware of that might make your work with them more effective, because there might be less issues because you're not just reacting to everything they do.
Fascinating. Really, really interesting. Really interesting. I just think out of this paper, a coach can get a clearer picture of the definitions and the causes and the consequences. Yes, they'd know what they are, but being able to articulate causes and consequences and definitions succinctly, I think is really important, and then get a clearer idea of some solutions. I just think this is really, really awesome stuff, guys. So thank you so much for sharing this. And I know that you will have tapped the interest of everybody listening in. So I'm not too sure how much social media you do, whether you want to be contacted, but if that is the case, Fiona, why don't we come to you first? Do you do social media? If so, where can people follow you? And if somebody is really interested in contacting you, where could they contact you?
Yeah, so do social media. So Twitter, what are the others? ResearchGate, those type of things. On both of those.
What's your handle on Twitter?
At Fiona_Leggat. And yeah, you can send me a message whenever, and I'll try and get back to you. But yes, if you have any questions about kind of what we're doing now and that the more up-to-date stuff, you would best be contacting Sean on his social media.
Neat little transition to Sean there.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at Sean G Figgins is my handle.
Perfect. Hey, thank you both so much for coming on and talking about your research. Really, really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much for letting us share it with you.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Site Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.